Tonight on Dreadful Visions, we look at the moments when an ordinary day slowly turns into something you cannot explain. Most of the time, the warning signs are so small that we barely notice them. A light left on, a door that should be closed, a sound from another room. Nothing that seems important on its own. But sometimes, those little things start to connect, and by the time you understand what is happening, it is already too late. These are 3 stories where everything was normal until it wasn't. Story 1. The door was already unlocked. 27-year-old Ryan Keller had recently moved into a small apartment complex outside Portland, Oregon. The building was nothing special. It was a 3-story property with dark brick walls, narrow hallways, and a small parking lot behind the building. Ryan had chosen it because it was cheap, close to work, and quiet enough that he could finally get away from the noise of the city. He had been living there for almost 2 months, and everything had gone smoothly. His neighbors kept to themselves. The building manager was rarely seen. The elevators worked most of the time, and the only real complaint Ryan had was the laundry room being on the other side of the building. He worked from home 3 days a week, which meant he spent a lot of time inside the apartment. Because of that, he quickly developed a routine. Every morning, he locked the front door before starting work. Every evening, he checked the deadbolt before going to bed. It became automatic. On a Tuesday night in late October, Ryan went to bed around midnight after watching television for an hour. Before getting into bed, he walked through the apartment one last time, turned off the kitchen light, checked the balcony door, and locked the front door. He remembered doing it clearly. The deadbolt clicked into place. Ryan went asleep. At 2:13 in the morning, he woke up for no obvious reason. The apartment was completely silent. He lay still for a few seconds, listening. Nothing. Then he heard a faint sound from the hallway. A quiet creak, like someone putting their weight against the floor. Ryan opened his eyes. He waited. Another creak followed. This time, it came from somewhere just outside his bedroom. He reached for his phone and checked the time. 2:13 a.m. Ryan slowly sat up. He told himself it was probably the building settling. The apartment was old enough to make strange sounds at night. Then he heard the front door. A soft click. Ryan froze. He knew he had locked it. He grabbed his phone and quietly stepped out of bed. The bedroom door was slightly open, and the hallway beyond it was dark. He didn't switch on the lights. Instead, he moved toward the hallway and stopped a few feet from the front door. The deadbolt was turned. The door was unlocked. Ryan stared at it. For several seconds, he couldn't understand what he was looking at. He was absolutely certain he had locked it. He slowly walked forward and checked the handle. The door opened. Cold air came into the apartment from the hallway. Nobody was standing outside. Ryan looked left, then right. The hallway was empty. He shut the door, locked it again, and stood there for almost a minute with his hand still resting on the deadbolt. He considered calling the police. Instead, he convinced himself that he had made a mistake. Maybe he had been more tired than he remembered. Maybe the deadbolt hadn't fully turned. That explanation felt stupid, but it was easier than believing someone had unlocked his door. Ryan went back to bed. The next morning, everything felt normal. He worked from home, made coffee, answered emails, and eventually forgot about the night before, until he noticed something on his kitchen counter. A set of keys. Ryan stopped. They weren't his. They looked almost identical to his own apartment keys, except there was a small piece of blue tape wrapped around the top. He picked them up and immediately called the building manager. The manager went quiet when Ryan described them. He asked where Ryan had found them. On my kitchen counter. The manager told him he would come over immediately. 20 minutes later, he arrived, took the keys from Ryan, and examined them without saying much. Then he asked Ryan a question that made his stomach drop. "Did you ever give anyone a spare key?" Ryan shook his head. "No." The manager looked toward the front door, then back at the keys. "Because those keys were issued to the previous tenant." Ryan stared at the manager. The keys were from the previous tenant? The manager nodded and explained that the apartment had been rented by a man named Eric Dawson for almost 4 years before Ryan moved in. According to the building's records, Eric had returned his keys when he moved to another state. The locks had been rekeyed before Ryan signed the lease, which meant the old keys should no longer have worked. Ryan looked down at the blue tape wrapped around the key. Then he remembered something. The night before, when he had heard the front door unlock, he had assumed someone had been standing outside. But what if nobody had been outside at all? What if the lock had been opened from inside the apartment? Ryan immediately checked the deadbolt. The manager removed the inside cover plate and examined the mechanism. Nothing looked damaged, but there were fresh scratches around the screws. Someone had opened it recently. The manager called a locksmith. While they waited, Ryan walked through the apartment again. This time he looked at every room differently. The closets, the bathroom, the storage area beneath the kitchen sink. Then he noticed something strange above the bedroom closet. A small square panel had been fitted into the ceiling. Ryan had never seen it before because it was painted the same color as the walls. The manager looked up. That's not on the building plans. A maintenance worker was called to remove it. Behind the panel was a narrow space between the ceiling and the roof structure, just large enough for someone to crawl through. There was no obvious reason for it to exist. The worker shined a flashlight inside. Dust covered most of the beams, but a narrow section looked different. The dust had been disturbed. Fresh footprints crossed the wooden supports. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. Someone had been up there. Police arrived shortly afterward and searched the crawl space from the neighboring maintenance access point. They found an old sleeping bag, empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a portable phone charger. Someone had been hiding above Ryan's apartment. But the discovery didn't end there. A detective found several small objects tucked into the insulation. Receipts, photographs, and handwritten notes. The notes listed Ryan's daily routine. Work from home Tuesday. Leaves at 5:30 Thursday. Usually asleep by midnight. The detective asked Ryan whether he had ever noticed someone watching him. Ryan thought about it. He remembered seeing a man in the parking lot twice during his first month in the building. He had assumed the man was visiting another tenant. The investigator then asked the building manager about Eric Dawson, the previous tenant. The manager explained that Eric had left suddenly after complaints from neighbors about hearing movement above their apartments late at night. At the time, everyone assumed there was a plumbing or heating problem. Police checked Eric's old employment records and discovered that he had worked as a maintenance contractor. He had enough knowledge of the building's layout to access the hidden spaces above several apartments. More importantly, he had never actually moved out of state. He had left the building months earlier, but investigators discovered that he had been using different addresses and temporary jobs since then. The strange part was that nobody knew where he had gone. Police eventually found evidence that Eric had returned to the apartment complex after Ryan moved in. He had been using the hidden crawl space to enter the apartment whenever Ryan was away. The old key on Ryan's kitchen counter had not been left there by accident. It had been placed there to let Ryan know someone could still reach him. The night the door unlocked had been a test. Eric had wanted to know whether Ryan would investigate. Instead, Ryan had gone back to bed. Police later discovered security footage from a neighboring building showing Eric entering the property around 1:40 that morning and leaving less than an hour later. He was arrested several weeks afterward in another state after being stopped during a routine traffic check. Investigators never found evidence that he had directly attacked Ryan, but they discovered notes on several former tenants, suggesting that Ryan was not the first person Eric had secretly watched. Ryan moved out within a month. Before leaving, he changed every lock, installed cameras, and checked the ceiling panel one final time. There was nothing inside. Still, he never forgot that first night. The part that bothered him most wasn't finding the sleeping bag. It wasn't the photographs. It wasn't even discovering that someone had been living above him. It was the keys. Because when Ryan found them on his kitchen counter, he hadn't been home for almost 9 hours. Story 2. The window across the street. 34-year-old Lauren Hayes had lived in her new house for less than 3 weeks when she first noticed the light across the street. The house belonged to an older couple who had apparently moved out years earlier. The property had been sitting empty for as long as Lauren had been looking at houses, with overgrown grass, faded curtains, and a small sign in the front yard indicating that it was still being prepared for sale. Lauren didn't think much about it. She had moved to a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, after spending most of her 20s in an apartment downtown. She wanted somewhere calmer, with a driveway, a backyard, and enough space to work from home. The house was perfect. At least, it seemed perfect. Lauren's first 2 weeks passed without any problems. She gradually unpacked boxes, learned where the lights were, figured out which grocery store was closest, and started recognizing a few of the people who walked their dogs on the street each morning. One of the first things she noticed about the neighborhood was how early everyone seemed to go to bed. By 11 at night, most houses were completely dark. That was why the light across the street caught her attention. It appeared for the first time on a Thursday night. Lauren had been standing at her kitchen window around 11:30 p.m., drinking a glass of water before heading upstairs. Across the street, one upstairs bedroom window was glowing softly. Nothing strange about that, until she remembered the house was supposed to be empty. She watched the window for a few seconds. A shadow moved across the curtains. Lauren froze. Someone was definitely inside. She considered calling the police, but the explanation was probably simple. Maybe the house had been sold. Maybe the owners had returned. Maybe the realtor had forgotten to update the sign. She went to bed. The next morning, she noticed the upstairs window was dark again. Lauren mentioned it casually to her neighbor, a woman named Patricia who lived 2 houses down. Patricia immediately knew which house she meant. She stared at Lauren for a moment before asking whether she had actually seen someone inside. "Just a light," Lauren replied. "And a shadow." Patricia told her the house had been empty since the previous owners moved into assisted living almost 18 months earlier. No one was supposed to be living there. Lauren laughed and said she was probably overthinking it. Patricia didn't laugh. She simply told Lauren to keep her curtains closed at night. That conversation stayed with Lauren longer than she wanted it to. A few nights later, the upstairs light appeared again. 11:28 p.m. Exactly the same window. This time, Lauren watched from farther away. The curtain moved. A shadow crossed behind it. Then, the light went off. Lauren felt uneasy, but curiosity eventually won. She took a quick photograph through her own window. The image was blurry, but it clearly showed the illuminated bedroom and the outline of a person standing beside the curtain. The following morning, Lauren sent the photograph to Patricia. Patricia called her immediately. "Don't look at that house tonight." Lauren laughed nervously. "Why?" Patricia said something she never forgot. "Because whoever is in there knows you're watching." Lauren didn't believe her. Not completely. That evening, Lauren kept the downstairs lights off and avoided the kitchen window. Around midnight, however, she heard a faint sound outside, a soft scraping noise. Then another. She cautiously looked through the curtains. The upstairs window across the street was dark, but something else had changed. The front gate of the empty house was open. Lauren watched for nearly a minute. Nothing moved. Then a figure stepped out from the side of the house. It crossed the front yard slowly and disappeared behind a parked car. Lauren stepped away from the window. Her heart was beating faster now. She locked the front door, checked the back door, closed the curtains in every room downstairs. Then she went upstairs and turned off the hallway light. For the next hour, nothing happened. Eventually, Lauren convinced herself that she had imagined the figure. She got into bed. Just before falling asleep, she heard a notification sound from her phone. Lauren reached for it. A photograph had been sent to her. There was no message attached. It was a picture of her house, taken from across the street. The photo showed her kitchen window, and in the reflection, Lauren could see herself standing inside. Lauren stared at the photograph. For several seconds, she couldn't move. The picture showed her own kitchen window from across the street. She could see the glass, the curtains, and the outline of herself standing inside. Whoever had taken it had been close enough to capture her clearly. Lauren immediately checked the time on the message. 12:17 a.m. She looked toward the bedroom window. Across the street, the empty house was completely dark. She pulled the curtains shut and called 911. While she waited for the dispatcher, Lauren explained everything that had happened, including the light, the figure, the photograph, and the fact that the house was supposed to be vacant. The dispatcher told her to remain inside, lock every door and window, and avoid approaching the property. A police cruiser arrived less than 10 minutes later. 2 officers searched Lauren's yard first. Then they checked the street. Finally, they approached the empty house. Lauren watched from behind her curtains as flashlights moved through the downstairs windows. A few minutes later, one of the officers walked back toward her house. He told Lauren they had found signs of recent entry. The back door of the empty property had been forced open and repaired from the inside. There were fresh footprints throughout the house. Someone had been staying there, but the upstairs bedroom was empty. The police searched the attic, basement, closets, and crawl spaces. They found blankets, food containers, several charged phones, and a small folding chair positioned directly in front of the upstairs window facing Lauren's house. On the chair sat a camera. It was pointed directly at the kitchen. Lauren felt sick when the officer explained what they believed had happened. The person living inside the empty house had been watching her from the moment she moved in. He knew when her lights turned on. He knew which rooms she used most often. He knew what time she usually came home. He had even photographed her through the window while she was standing in her kitchen. Investigators found dozens of photographs inside the house. Most showed Lauren. Some were taken during the day. Others were taken late at night. The police believed the stalker had entered the property before Lauren ever moved into the neighborhood and had remained hidden there after the previous owners left. The vacant house had given him a perfect place to watch the street without anyone noticing. The photograph Lauren received had been sent from one of several prepaid phones discovered inside the room. Detectives eventually traced one of the phones to a former delivery driver who had worked in the neighborhood years earlier. He knew the streets well and had previously delivered packages to several houses on the block. That familiarity made it easy for him to move around without attracting attention. He was arrested 2 weeks later after police found him staying inside another vacant property several miles away. Investigators discovered similar photographs from other neighborhoods stored on his devices. Lauren never found out exactly how long he had been watching her. She only knew that the person across the street had been paying attention long before she realized someone was there. She moved out of the house 3 months later. Before leaving, she stood in the kitchen one final time. The property across the street was empty again. The upstairs window was dark. The curtains were gone. And for the first time since moving in, Lauren could look outside without wondering whether someone was looking back. But she never forgot the photograph that started everything, because there had been one detail she didn't understand until much later. The picture had been taken from inside the empty house, but the police discovered the camera itself had been moved from the bedroom to the hallway less than an hour before they arrived. Whoever sent her that photograph had been inside the house while she was calling the police. Story 3. The spare bedroom wasn't empty. 31-year-old Caleb Morris had spent almost 6 months looking for a house before finally finding one he could afford in a quiet suburb outside Nashville, Tennessee. It wasn't his dream home, but it was close to work, had a large backyard, and came with an extra bedroom he planned to turn into a small recording studio. The previous owners had left almost nothing behind. A few curtain rods, some old shelves in the garage, a broken lamp in the attic. The real estate agent told Caleb the couple had moved out quickly after the husband accepted a job several states away. The house had been empty for almost 3 months before Caleb bought it. Everything felt normal during the first week. Caleb spent most of his evenings unpacking boxes and putting furniture together. He learned which floorboards creaked, which kitchen cabinets stuck, and how long it took for the shower upstairs to warm up. The spare bedroom was the last room he touched. It sat at the end of the upstairs hallway and had originally been used as a guest room. The room was almost empty except for a built-in closet, a ceiling fan, and a small wooden shelf mounted beside the window. Caleb planned to use it for recording equipment. On the 9th night, he was carrying a box upstairs when he noticed the closet door was open. He stopped. He was sure he'd closed it earlier. Caleb walked over and looked inside. Nothing. Just an empty shelf and a few hangers. He closed the door. The following morning, it was open again. This time, Caleb laughed. The house was old. Maybe the latch didn't catch properly. He didn't think much about it until the same thing happened for the next 3 nights. Every morning, the closet door was open. Every evening, Caleb closed it. He eventually placed a small piece of clear tape across the edge of the door to see whether it was opening on its own. The next morning, the tape was broken. The closet was open. Caleb stood there staring at it. There was no obvious explanation. He checked the hinges, the latch, the frame. Everything looked normal. He decided to install a small indoor camera in the hallway facing the bedroom entrance. It wasn't because he thought someone was inside. He simply wanted to prove the door was faulty. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, the recording showed the closet door remaining shut for the entire evening. At 2:38 a.m., however, the camera detected movement. Caleb opened the footage. The hallway was completely empty. The closet door had slowly opened by itself. No person appeared. He watched it 3 more times. The door had opened. There was nobody in frame. Caleb inspected the room again the following morning. This time, he noticed something he'd missed before. The wooden shelf beside the window sat slightly away from the wall, only by an inch or 2. He pulled it forward. Behind it was a narrow gap. Caleb shone his phone light inside. There was a dark space behind the wall. At first, he assumed it was simply part of the framing. Then he saw something. A plastic water bottle. Caleb froze. He pulled the shelf completely away from the wall. Behind it was a small opening leading into a narrow, unfinished space between the bedroom wall and the attic stairs. Someone had been using it. There was an old blanket folded on the floor, a flashlight, several empty food wrappers, and a phone charger plugged into an extension cable. Caleb immediately stepped backward. The space was far too small to be comfortable, but it was large enough for someone to hide inside. He called the police. While waiting, he remained downstairs. Officers arrived and searched the house before entering the hidden space. They found more evidence: a backpack, several bottles of water, a second phone charger, and a small notebook. The notebook contained dates, not random dates. Dates Caleb recognized. The day he moved in, the day his furniture arrived, the first night he slept in the house, the day he went to work, the day he visited his parents. Someone had been tracking his movements. Then one officer discovered something much worse. At the back of the hidden space was a narrow opening leading directly into the attic. Caleb suddenly understood how someone could have been entering and leaving the hiding place without appearing on his cameras. The attic connected to the garage through an old service hatch. Whoever had been hiding inside the house had access to almost every part of the property, and they had been there long enough to know Caleb's routine. The police searched the attic. They found fresh footprints in the dust, leading toward the garage. The police followed the footprints through the attic and down toward the garage. The trail was fresh. Dust had been disturbed along the wooden floor, and one section of insulation had been pushed aside recently. Near the garage entrance, officers found a small gap where someone could squeeze through from outside without being seen from the driveway. Caleb stood in the hallway listening as the officers searched the rest of the property. The house no longer felt like his. Every room suddenly looked different. The spare bedroom, the attic, the garage, even the hallway camera. All of it had been observed by someone Caleb had never known was there. One of the officers eventually came downstairs carrying a small black backpack. Inside were several changes of clothes, food wrappers, a folding knife, spare batteries, and a second notebook. The notebook was newer than the first. This one contained notes about Caleb: what time he usually woke up, when he left for work, how long he stayed away, when he received deliveries. Even small details, like which nights he usually fell asleep with the television running downstairs. The officer told Caleb that whoever had been hiding inside the house had not simply stumbled across it. They had been studying him. Police contacted the previous owners immediately. At first, the couple insisted they had never allowed anyone into the property after moving out. Then the husband remembered something. Several months before they sold the house, they had discovered signs that someone had been entering through the attic. They assumed it was a squatter. They changed the locks and repaired a broken window before putting the house on the market. They never discovered who had been inside. Caleb suddenly understood something else. The previous owners had probably been telling the truth when they said the house had been empty for 3 months. The person hiding there had simply stayed out of sight. Investigators searched the property records and eventually found a connection. A former contractor named Stephen Walsh had worked on the house years earlier. He had installed part of the attic insulation and helped repair the garage after a storm. That meant he knew about the hidden spaces between the walls. He knew about the service hatch, and he knew the property had an unfinished section behind the spare bedroom. More importantly, he had a criminal record for trespassing and burglary. Police believed he had started using vacant homes as temporary hiding places, entering before properties were sold and remaining inside after new owners moved in. He never stayed in one place permanently. He simply waited, watched, and moved on when he thought he might be discovered. Detectives eventually found Stephen staying inside another empty property almost 40 miles away. He was arrested without incident. During the search, officers recovered several storage containers filled with property taken from previous homes. Some items were never reported missing because the owners had assumed they had simply misplaced them during their moves. Caleb moved out before the month was over. He never used the spare bedroom as a recording studio. He never touched the built-in closet again. A few months later, after the house was sold to another family, Caleb returned once to collect a forgotten box from the garage. He stood in the driveway for several minutes before leaving. The house looked normal. The windows were clean. The lawn was freshly cut. Nothing about it suggested that someone had once been living inside the walls. But one detail stayed with him. The closet door in the spare bedroom had never been faulty. The camera footage had proved that. Someone had opened it. Someone had closed it. Someone had been using that room while Caleb slept down the hall. And Caleb still thinks about the final note found in the second notebook. It contained only one sentence. The new owners always noticed the closet first. That was the last thing Caleb ever read about the house. He never learned whether the person hiding there had been watching him from the first night, or whether they had already been inside before he even bought it. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment telling me which story unsettled you the most, and subscribe to Dreadful Visions for more realistic horror stories built around the ordinary places and situations we trust every day. New long-form videos are uploaded every other day, and every new story is another reminder that sometimes the safest-looking places are the ones hiding the most unsettling secrets. Until next time, keep your doors locked, check the places you never think to look, and remember that just because a house is empty doesn't mean you're alone. Sleep well tonight, if you can.